Jesus saith unto her, Thy brother shall rise again. Martha saith unto him, I know that he shall rise again in the resurrection at the last day. Jesus said unto her, I am the resurrection and the life. He that believeth in me, though he were dead, yet shall he live. And whosoever liveth and believeth in me shall never die.
This week is the 400th anniversary of the printing of the King James Version of the Bible. So up and down the country there'll be celebrations of what's a really important historical and cultural occasion. But lots of Christians are confused about the origins of the Bible. And to be honest, now we have so many translations. We've got different translations here. We have translations that are pink with zips, Bibles with stickers, and Bibles for children. So we're going to go through a little bit of the history of the King James Bible. And we'll do that as a quiz with some questions you might want to try and see if you know the answer to. And we're going to start with a really easy question first. So first question. Was it the first translation into English? The answer to that one is no. I only include that because apparently a really prominent English church figure got that wrong in the media this year, which is a bit embarrassing. Lots of people had translated it. A monk called Bede, a king called Alfred, a scholar called Wycliffe translated it, and after that it became illegal. It was banned to translate it. But then at the Reformation it started to be translated again, and London was right at the heart of it. These two people were very important. The one on the left is the Bishop of London, called Tunstall, and the one on the right is William Tyndale. And in 1526, William Tyndale came to London and asked the Bishop of London to help him translate the Bible into English, which wasn't such a crazy idea. Cuthbert Tunstall had been involved with Erasmus in getting a Greek edition of the New Testament together, which is what really kicked off the Reformation, and Tyndale thought he might help, but Tunstall was absolutely against it, strongly opposed, refused to help. So Tyndale went down the road to a cloth merchant who funded it all, and Tyndale translated the New Testament and had it printed illegally, which Tunstall was very unhappy about it and banned it in London in his diocese and collected them together and burned them in a big bonfire outside St Paul's Cathedral. In fact, he was so against it that he sent friends of his to Antwerp, which is where Tyndale had gone to hide, to buy up every single copy of Tyndale's translation they could, which they did and brought them home, and Tunstall destroyed them, which shows that clergy haven't always understood market forces maybe as well as they should. So Tyndale took the money and printed a load more, which then flooded into London to fill the streets with his version of the New Testament. So no, not the first translation into English. Next question. So was it King James's idea? Well, here he is, looking very impressive, King of England, Wales, Scotland, France, Ireland, and he was king in 1567 of Scotland, and then became King of England in 1603. And the church that he inherited isn't the kind of happy, united place that maybe we'd imagine the church used to be. In fact, it had been Roman Catholic as recently as 1558 when Queen Mary died, so very recently. And there's still lots of disagreement in the Church of England over whether it should be a more Catholic church or a more Protestant church. And when King James becomes king, they decide to ask him to favour the Protestant side. And they get up a big petition, the Puritans do, and send the king their list of complaints, which isn't a crazy idea because in Scotland he's been king of a Presbyterian church, so maybe he'll listen to them. So in 1604 he gathers some Puritans and some bishops for a big conference. And at the conference there were two very key figures. John Reynolds, who's the guy on the left for the Puritans, and Richard Bancroft, who is the Bishop of London, different Bishop of London, on the right for the bishops. And roughly speaking, the score was Puritans 0, bishops 7,038. Or not quite 0, because the Puritans got one of the things they asked for, just one. They asked for a new Bible, saying there was something wrong with the old translation being translated by the bishops. The bishops weren't that keen to change it. But King James agrees, mainly because we think he didn't like the footnotes in the Bible that they were using, the most popular Bible, the Geneva Bible, that said scurrilous things like, in Exodus 1, there's a bit where the midwives conspire against Pharaoh to keep alive the children that Pharaoh is trying to kill. And the footnote would have said something like, so you see, you're allowed to resist the king if he's trying to murder lots and lots of babies. And King James didn't like that very much, thought that was a big attack on his authority, so he wanted a new Bible. And one of the things that was insisted on for the King James was there will be no footnotes. So that was the one thing the bishops lost on, but Bancroft was a really smooth operator, and the moment it was agreed, he got charge of the project, and he was allowed to pick the people who would translate it. They had 6 companies of translators, 2 in London, 2 in Oxford, and 2 in Cambridge. So our next question is going to be about what sort of translation it was and who it was against. So was it anti-Protestant? Was it anti-Catholic? Was it anti-Calvinist? Was it anti-Puritan? Or was it none of the above? Well, it certainly wasn't anti-Protestant. Everyone who was involved in the translation, they were Protestant. In fact, to translate the Bible at all was a Protestant thing to do, was an anti-Catholic thing to do. So it wasn't so it was an anti-Catholic translation. Was it anti-Calvinist? Well, here's a picture of someone who was, if anyone was, he was the lead translator. His name is Lancelot Andrews. He headed one of the London companies of translators. And he's a good example of how mixed and confused the Church of England was at the time. So he is very anti-Catholic. In fact, early on in his career, when he was preaching in London at the church called St Giles, he recommended to his congregation a set of books by a young man called John Calvin, who'd just written them in Geneva, because he thought they were so good at correcting what was wrong with the Pope. But then later on, he is very clearly the leader of the ceremonialist party. In other words, on the Lord's Supper, on what clergy should wear, on his views on predestination. He's very much opposed to Calvinists. But what he's most famous for and remembered for is as a preacher. So he's a good example of how mixed things were. So it's not is it anti-Calvinist then? Because he's involved? Well, no. In fact, most of the translators were Calvinists, as was most of the Church of England at the time. What it's designed to be is anti-Puritan. So even though they had asked for it, it was designed to be a translation that would keep them in their place. And you can see that in some of the rules that were laid down for it. So James, the king, he insisted that when they met significant words like the word ecclesia, which could mean gathering or congregation, he said you must translate that church. And when you meet the words for the officers in a church, the important people there, you must translate it bishop to make it clear what kind of a church the Bible is proposing. So, was it, next question, was it a fresh translation out of the original languages? What do you think? The answer is actually false. They were really clear that wasn't what they were doing and not what they were told to do by the king. But really, the answer is true, because they took such a huge amount of effort to go back to not just the original Greek and Hebrew it was written in, but they lined up every single other language that it had been translated into. Different Egyptian languages, Syrian languages, the Latin version as well as a Roman Catholic English translation. And they, at the revision stage, someone would come with their translation already and would read it out to a room full of people who each had open a different other translation in front of them, and then ask annoying, difficult questions until they were sure they'd got it as good and as close as they could do. But they invented 2 new sorts of footnotes. Having been told they weren't allowed footnotes that knocked the king and his authority, they brought in 2 new sorts. One was where some of the manuscripts disagreed with the other ones. There'd just be a footnote on the side saying other manuscripts say something different. They also had a translation footnote. So if, as here, the word could be translated when the fruit is brought forth, or could be translated when the fruit was ripe, they'd put them both there so that as you're reading, you can decide which of the 2 you think it most likely is. And you'll find those same sort of footnotes in modern English Bibles today. And people sometimes get worried about that, think maybe, do we not know what word it really should be? Do we not know what it means? Whereas actually that we can have that kind of footnote is a real sign of strength and a reason to give us confidence. If we didn't have the manuscript footnotes, that would mean we only really had one old copy. And since we don't have the originals, we'd have no way of knowing whether that one had lots of mistakes in it from copying. Whereas actually we have thousands of originals, and they agree so substantially that we can get it right back so that there's only 1 or 2 place names, things like that, and occasionally a larger section that we're not sure about. And none of those really affect the meaning or doctrines of the Christian faith. And the translation one, well, here in London, when I'm maybe speaking to students about that, I just say, who here has another language that they speak? And in London, normally that's about half the room. And you say, well, we're speaking in English now. Can we understand each other? And the answer is yes, even though you wouldn't be able to take every word in English and translate it exactly one for one into another language. That's just normal translation. And actually, Jesus and the apostles were happy with that as well. They would have used a Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible, and they quote from it in the Bible that we have. So Christians don't believe about the Bible what Muslims believe about the Quran, that you have to stay in the original language or you don't really have it. The normal human processes of translation are fine. You can understand what God is saying in translation. So the only question is whether a translation is a good, accurate one. And the King James translation they worked really hard at, that it could be a really good, accurate translation out of those original languages. So was it the most popular Bible of its time? The answer is no. It was huge. It was enormous. It was designed for reading in pulpits, in churches, and they didn't even have to buy it. It was only as the old one fell apart that they then replaced it with the King James. And the one that was the most popular at the time was much smaller. It was the more Protestant one that they were trying to replace, the Geneva Bible. That's the one you'd have had at home by your bed and could have read comfortably. So if it wasn't the most popular Bible of its time, is it the most popular book of all time? And the answer is yes. Amazingly, it's the most popular book that sold the most copies in the world and still does, sells thousands and thousands of copies a year, and has had an amazing and important influence across the world. I wonder who you think said this. Here's a quote. "We are a Christian culture, we come from a Christian culture, and not to know the King James Bible is to be in some small way barbarian." Do you think maybe that was a bishop or some church figure? It's Richard Dawkins. Professor Richard Dawkins, again, not famous for believing in God, the famous atheist, but saying actually not to know this Bible is not to know enough about England. Or here's another quote. This is what they said to our Queen at her coronation. "Our gracious Queen, to keep your Majesty ever mindful of the law and the gospel of God, we present you with this book, the most valuable thing that this world affords. Here is wisdom, this is the royal law, these are the lively oracles of God." Often as Christians we can be a bit embarrassed about the Bible, but actually I think there's no need to be. With students in London, I encourage them to, with their friends, just to say, does anyone want to read the Bible with me, to have a look at it, open it up? And the normal response from people who've never read the Bible, grown up not really hearing the Bible stories at school, is that this is fascinating. These are the most important questions in life, opened up in an interesting way, and people love to read it and find out what the Bible has to say.
I am the resurrection and the life. He that believeth in me, though he were dead, yet shall he live. And whosoever liveth and believeth in me shall never die. Believest thou this? She saith unto him, Yea, Lord, I believe that thou art the Christ, the Son of God, which should come into the world.